In this interview with the Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, Professor Diana Ürge-Vorsatz gives her perspective on a range of critical issues, in part presenting a glass-half-full perspective despite so many mounting challenges. This was recorded on Saturday the 16th of November at the midway point through COP29. Since the COP has ended, countries have finalised a $300 billion pledge to vulnerable nations set against a required $1.3 trillion by 2035. Trust between so-called developed and developing or vulnerable nations remains stubbornly low, but meeting the $1.3 trillion required funding is not a charity gift, but rather a collaborative investment in all our futures. Until we collectively realise the only way forward is with all hands seen as equal, the fate for us all remains entirely bleak. More COP29 interviews are on the way, as well as an interview this week with the author of a new study on the state of the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC, that risks upending all our climate rhetoric to date. If you want a fast-paced journey through the last 8 COPs from Paris to the UAE, then order my book Cop Out online in paperback or audio format from all the main retailers. This was my 9th cop-out experience, and I'll be writing a supplementary chapter in the coming weeks that will include astonishing in-person admissions from delegates of fossil fuel producing nations, as well as forays into the north of Azerbaijan through decimated landscapes and threadbare ecosystems. Thank you to all subscribers, and thank you for listening to everyone. So Diana, thank you very much for taking the time. Can you just start by telling me what the IPCC sort of focus through your lens is at this COP29?
Thank you very much, Nick, first of all, for the invitation. I'm extremely privileged. I think this is the best climate-related podcast. At least I learned so much from it, so thank you for your work. The IPCC's role at this event is usually just to disseminate our knowledge and information, and anything that is relevant for negotiations, just to provide the background science. So here, that is exactly what we are doing. We are having a pavilion together with WMO and the Mary Foundation, so we have events there, and whenever possible, we are participating in the sessions just as the voice of science if we are invited. We also have a lot of bilateral meetings with different organizations and trying to strengthen our relationship with anyone who wants to use science in their decisions and in their work.
Okay, and obviously with this COP, we've had this sort of US administration coming out quite strong on regulating methane emissions. How does methane risk fit into the global emissions scenario?
Well, methane is a much stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So while it is also shorter lived, which means basically any carbon dioxide we emit in human scale, it's going to stay there. Methane is much shorter lived. So that means that, in fact, we can almost achieve faster results if we are able to control methane emissions. We also see that methane concentrations are increasing very rapidly in the last couple of years. So there is a lot of new emphasis on how to handle methane and what we can do about it. So certainly an emphasis at this COP on methane is extremely important, because there are, first of all, larger concerns, but also many opportunities. So hopefully progress on methane that we achieved at this COP are going to help the climate, and perhaps some of the steps will be kind of easier to achieve than major carbon dioxide emission reductions.
Okay, and we hear a lot of talk around the 1.5 degrees boundary, if you like, but there's also a lot of confusion. A lot of people saying let's stay below it. IPCC Chair Jim Skier recently said that we've missed 1.5 degrees C, and it will take a heroic effort to stay below 2 degrees C this century. That was in the Telegraph last month. The implications of this statement are really, really serious. How can the IPCC make itself better heard or better understood when literally everything around us is at stake?
Well, that's a very good question. And certainly the IPCC itself doesn't have new statements on 1.5 degrees, since we, as an organization, we have to base any official statements based on our reports. But our reports and the latest research on any of the reports that have been published were finished in 2021. So that since then, quite a lot of things happened. Temperatures have increased substantially. Nevertheless, of course, we still can make some statements based on the earlier science. So first of all, what's important to understand that annual temperatures have natural variability. And it's true that in the last 2 years, we are seeing an extreme increase. Nevertheless, if we look back into the records, we do see similar increases and jumps in the previous few decades, and then some stabilization and going back. So if we look at the IPCC projections, what these temperatures show are still within those projections. They are truly on the higher side, but they are within this range. Now, just because we exceeded 1.5 degrees for 12 months or even a year or even 16 months and so on, it does not yet mean that we have yet reached 1.5, and that's not what the IPCC chair referred to either. So that is just important to clarify, because a lot of the media says, oh, we are over the Paris goal. That's not true. Nevertheless, and what Jim is referring to, we are really extremely close. We are getting closer and closer. So officially, because what we look at the 20-year running average, because that's when we kind of smooth out the natural variability. And we look at this 20-year running average, we are more only at 1.3 degrees. But that means we are getting extremely close, because especially if we look at the so-called carbon budget, that means, because I mentioned that carbon dioxide stays in atmosphere for a very long time, that means that any amount we emit will kind of already commit us to a certain level of warming. So we have only a certain remaining window to emit before we force the climate to warm to a certain level. And our carbon budget is really, really declining very seriously and very fast. And since we don't really see emissions dropping dramatically, in fact, they are still increasing, although important that they're increasing less and less, but they're still increasing. That means we are going to deplete that remaining carbon budget very fast, and we are very likely to reach 1.5. Nevertheless, as an individual expert, not as an IPCC vice chair, my point, and I hear also a lot in your podcast, is, are we there at 1.5 or not? It's really not about the precise digits, because there's so much uncertainty anyway. Even whether we get to 1.5 or not, this really depends on what probability we take. So, for example, a lot of our numbers in terms of what emissions lead to what temperature is now based on a 50% probability. And we say a lot of times, you don't get on a plane if there is 50% chance of falling down. So, but if you take a 66% probability of staying with 1.5, you're already having even less carbon budget. And also already there is so much uncertainty just in the climate sensitivity and other parameters. So that's why I would say that every fraction of a degree matters. Just because what we do now may not keep the temperature 1.5, it doesn't mean that we have to do anything differently. We still have to do the same things as if we wanted to get to 1.5. It may take us to higher degrees, and certainly we have to prepare for even more climate impacts. Yeah. But we still have to do all that is in our ability to limit temperature rise to as low as we can, because every fraction of the degree matters.
Okay, and you just highlighted the point that when you step outside of your IPCC role, you are a researcher working in real time. When you look around you now and you're looking at the data, you see ocean heat waves, you see emissions. Some say they're plateauing, but they seem to keep going up. It seems very hard to get back or to achieve what we wanted to achieve when we were back in Paris, for example. Do you see any signals that we're going to bend the curve down from where you are?
I do. First of all, I think it's really disappointing that we always emphasize, the glass is half full, and we always only emphasize the empty glass. But the glass is half full. So just in the last cycle of the IPCC, during the 6th assessment cycle, at the beginning of the cycle, we were still considering scenarios, and they were quite realistic at that time. That could take us to 5, even to potentially 6 degrees of global warming towards the end of the century. by the end of the cycle, we almost debated whether we should still include these scenarios because they were already by then so completely unlikely. So even if we did everything wrong, it would be very unlikely that we would get to those temperatures. Now it's more, again, I don't like the war on single, decimals, because I don't think we can say that precisely. But clearly, we are somewhere between 2.5 and 4 degrees, much more likely, which is still extremely high. But I think we don't emphasize enough that, hey, just in, less than a decade,
Right.
we reduced our chances from 5 to 6 down to 2.5 to 4. That's really important. We don't emphasize enough that renewables are now supplying, a third of global electricity. In Europe, new renewables now, just intermittent renewables, supply more power than fossils. And this first half year, the role of fossils in power production dropped by 17%. So there is a lot we have done. Still, the problem is that right now, still energy demand for materials is growing faster than our ability to upscale clean energy. So that's why it's tremendously important not only to focus on to producing clean energy, but much more emphasis needs to be put on how also to curtail demand while increasing well-being, while giving the same amount of or even better services. And that's why I think it's the COP that what is happening here. There's a lot of pledges related to finance. And what's, for me, disappointing, that most of these pledges are still only on the supply side. But we cannot solve this fully on the supply side. We have to have both. We have to pull both levers, both the demand side lever and the supply side lever together. Otherwise, you're not going to get there. And there is very little attention in the COPs in general and in finance and investment and so on the demand side. So I think we really need to do both together. And in the sixth assessment report, the IPCC, the chapter, which was devoted to energy demand and services, which had a lot of really great material. And I think if we took more attention of that, we could bend the emission curve easier.
Okay. And if we look at, and you mentioned pledges, and they currently seem to go to between 2.7 and 3 degrees, around that sort of ballpark. And that's not good for an outcome. And that's just pledges. On the reality is that we're headed higher. And yet we've had Viktor Orban here this week saying we need fossil fuels. We see the COP hosts aiming to triple exports, with the EU as a big customer. The US wants to keep fracking. Other countries are doing deals. What do you make of the huge contradiction between what these powerful policymakers say and what you are putting forward as the factuals, the science?
Well, I think partially this is a little bit the scientific community's failure, because it is impossible to expect, I think, either policymakers or world leaders to make commitments which will get them unelected, or which will get them, or even corporate leaders, which will get them being sacked very quickly. So I think we need to face much more that our expectations need to be much more in line with not only political realities, but in general political expectations and what in the end voters also want. And there are many solutions where you can get closer to what politics and what societies want, and advanced climate goes better. So again, I'm not speaking on behalf of IPCC, but as a researcher, it's of course tremendously important to emphasize having less fossil fuels. Nevertheless, let's be honest, any government, if announced that, okay, tomorrow we will not have fossil fuels or something, there would be a revolt, because all of us are getting into our cars. Most of us here got into planes that took us here and so on. So it's not that easy. So instead of just taking the carpet from under us, first we should focus on how we can actually do the same good life without them. And then it will be almost automatically, perhaps we won't need fossil fuels. For example, cities. If we design better cities where you don't need to get into your car and be stuck in traffic 2 hours a day, but you can get to everywhere you want or you need to in your everyday basis, you may not need a car and you have a better quality of life. And there are many European cities which are going this way. Nevertheless, we see Baku, where literally when I go home to the hotel, literally for 2 kilometers, I'm not able to cross a 6-lane road. And it's not out in the highways. It's like in the middle of a residential district, but it's designed only for cars. So you're locked into a lifestyle, but also buildings. Today, we can build and retrofit every building basically in the world, but at least in the countries which are heating dominant, to have basically need virtually no energy. And this is not about major costs. So that means that almost every fossil fuel molecule we are using for heating buildings is almost wasted. And if we do these zero energy buildings, also it's much better for people because they will not need to spend so much on their energy bills, because we get rid of fuel poverty and so on. So I think we need to be much better align climate action with people's priorities. And there are many actions that we can do. And once we provide alternatives for good life without or with much less fossil fuels, then it will be much easier to act on these, both for politicians, corporate leaders, and everyone.
Sound very, very rational. For a lot of that stuff to happen, you're talking about town planning, and the subnational level has been much more successful than the national level. But the structural changes to really roll a lot of this stuff out is very difficult, especially when you come here and you see the 1,770 representatives of the fossil fuel industry blocking progress. And it's this blocking of the logical things that you're talking about seem to be slowing us right down to the point where we're crawling at a slow pace when things are moving very fast against us. I want to come back to the emissions pathways for 1.5 and 2 degrees that have within them greenhouse gas removal. And how much do these scenarios rely on greenhouse gas removals? And have you seen signals from researchers or engineers that they are actually going to be able to achieve these within any time frame that's useful to us?
Well, that's a very good question. And in our next cycle of the IPCC, we are likely to have a much stronger emphasis on greenhouse gas removals, because by now it is clear that keeping temperatures to 1.5 degree will require removals, and just removals are non-negotiable. However, the scale of the necessary removals depends on the scenario and depends on the pathway and in the assumptions which options are more important in the scenario. And this is where I want to point out that the scenarios that result in low removals actually are those which really focus much on energy demand, energy and material demand. So how to supply the same amount of well-being and wealth with lower amount of energy and material. And those are the only scenarios that can get us to low temperature goals with limited amount of removals. So that, again, I think leads us to the importance that I think also in your podcast and also in this whole COP, we need to talk much more about the demand for energy and materials, how we can get to be better off and still use less of these.
Okay, so that's your positive story. That's your emphasis where you want to push.
Well, the positive story is that if we focus on these, we can get a lot of other things done that we otherwise want. We showed in the IPCC that if you focus on demand-focused pathways, you will get much better air quality. You will get much more livable cities. It's much more. So these cities are much more socially inclusive, because if you don't have to get into a car, you have access to more jobs, to more healthcare, and so on. They're usually more just and more inclusive. So the positive story is really, if we want the world to be a better place on many of these characteristics, so then we have to see much more the solutions. We have more synergies with the sustainable development goals and climate. And these are usually the demand-focused solutions. Of course, demand alone cannot do it all, but my point is that we have to work much. So supply-side solutions and demand-side solutions need to work much closer together.
Okay. And just to end on, because we're under time constraints, we mentioned the outgoing US administration and the methane regulations. How does the potential withdrawal and even doubling down on fossil fuels from the incoming US administration alter the outlook for this decade? Does a safe climate slip further away?
I think it's not only one administration. Let's face it that half of the world voted in 2024. The majority of these votes actually went towards political leaderships which are much less favorable towards either environment or climate and so on. And I think we really need to face this. that the world, the population of the world has different priorities than earlier. So I think we really need to sit down and reflect on how we can still get these important environmental and climate goals done under these political realities. It doesn't help if we just keep wishing for something that we don't have. But I think it's much healthier if we really sit down with what people wanted and try to work with these. There are many opportunities, and you already mentioned yourself the subnational. So cities, and we will have a special report on cities, which is going to be tremendously important. Cities, I hope that cities are going to again play an even more important role than before, but also regions, states in the United States, counties, civil society, corporations, businesses, industries, all of these are already, there is a lot of the economy which is going ahead because renewables are the cheapest form of energy. So there is a lot already happening even without the highest level political will, and hopefully a lot of these actors will continue to move towards climate solutions.
I think they're going to throw us out, but I'll squeeze one more question. I was in a talk this week at the COP, and there was someone from the IPCC, an author, and they were talking about solar radiation management as we're sort of sailing past all our targets and we're not bending the curve fast enough. There's a lot of people saying from around the world, okay, we've got to start looking at this stuff. What's your view on that?
Well, certainly my personal view will be quite different from what the IPCC says. What the IPCC says, we will definitely have to tackle this more, since there is a lot more literature in this. If there is a lot more literature, we have to assess this. I hear you had a lot of podcasts on this. Personally, I'm still concerned about the unknowns. So there is still a lot that we don't know about this yet. So I think we need a lot more research on that first.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.